Hi everybody, it's Peter Zellens, Griniflix Adventure 8, and welcome to another video. Today's video is about lenses, Leica lenses, M lenses in fact. And I've got two lenses here, I'll be careful here, so you can actually see. I've got the one on the right there is the Leica 28mm f2.8 M lens, and also the Leica 28mm f2. The one on the right is my lens, it's the one I have right now, and the one on the left, the f2 version, is one that I've borrowed because I wanted to actually compare the two to see whether I should actually upgrade and go to the f2 versus the 2.8. The f2 is twice the price of the 2.8. Now in both cases these are second-hand lenses, and I did buy the f2.8 second-hand, and the one that's on the left, that's your left, my right, is also second-hand, but almost close to its new price. So do I upgrade? So one way to find out is to do the test. The camera that I'll be using to test these lenses is my Leica M11, and I've also got the 35mm f1.4 floating lens element. This isn't the latest 1.4 that's recently come out that has close focus. This is the one that focuses down to 0.7 meters. So I'll have this as a reference lens as well. 35mm focal length is my favorite. 28mm is not necessarily my favorite. When I'm doing the testing, I'm not doing testing from a general everybody's perspective. I'm doing it from my perspective and the type of photography that I like to do. When it comes to street photography or family photography or even event photography, where I want to be a little bit more subtle in my photography and not necessarily stick out so obvious with large cameras, I like the idea of having a small camera, high quality, so I can produce wonderful images, but not be obvious in my photography and not be intimidating to my subjects. So that's the reason for my love for the M series Leica cameras. Now what that also means is if I can go for a smaller lens, more compact lens, and still get that high quality for the type of scenarios that I'm shooting, that's a bonus for me. So I like compact, and wherever possible, if I can get a combination of compact and wide open aperture to give me that shallow depth of field and to enable me to photograph easier in low light conditions so I don't have to push up the ISO. That's also a benefit. Okay, so let's have a look at these two lenses. Both of these lenses have got their lens hoods on, and they're slightly different. So the f2 lens hood here is a screw lens hood, so we'll just take that one off so we'll have a bit of a comparison. The 2.8 has a slightly different arrangement. It's got these little tags here on both sides, and you have to press those tags in, and then that just comes off. You can actually see how that operates. Then you can see that the f2 is about 25% longer in its length, so the 2.8 is much more compact than the f2. You can see the 35mm is just slightly longer than the 28. So that's the 2.0, 28 2.8. It's almost half the length of the 35, so you can see the 2.8 is really compact, so that is a big bonus for the 2.8 version of the 28mm. So when we put the 2.8 version of the 28 on the M11, you can see how compact it is. It's really quite amazing. Now how I came to be more interested in the 28 was by getting the Leica Q2. When you compare the Q2 and the M11, you can see the big difference again. So as far as most compact now is still the M11 with a 28 2.8. So size has a huge impact on my desire to use the camera and the lens in certain situations. That's the physical aspect. The next aspect is what sort of results can you get, and how different are the two lenses with regards to their contrast, with their detail, We know that the f2 is one stop faster than the f2.8, so to compensate you'd have to go for a slower shutter speed or a higher ISO to get the similar type of image. We'll go into Lightroom and you'll be able to see the type of environment that I shot in, and we'll be able to compare the results between the 2.8 version, the f2 version of the 28mm, and also compare that to the 35mm f1.4. Here is the setup. So my subject is about 1 meter away from the camera or thereabouts, and my first lens I'm testing here is a 28mm f2.8. There you go, 28 2.8. And yes, so the apertures are here. It's showing here at 3.4. That's because Lightroom doesn't sync with the camera, so it's making the best guess. So if we have a look at the center here, this is zooming in about 200%. That's at 2.8, 4, 5.6, f8, f11, f16, and f22. So if we go to another section of the photograph there, so f2.8, we can see how this background image changes and how the bokeh changes as well. So where are we? We're in this area here. So that's at 2.8, at f4, 5.6, f8, f11, f16, at f22. You can see that at f22 you've got everything in focus. And if we have a look at the last image here, we've got a subject here right in the foreground here, so that's about 0.5 meters away. This is probably around the 2 meter distance. So at f22 you've pretty got everything in focus, and you've got a lot of detail basically everywhere. You can see even the back wall here. You can see the stitching and in this cloth bag here, and as close as the corner of this box. So at f22 you get a lot of detail, and how much more detail or less detail do you have between f2.8 and 22? Let's have a look as a comparison. So looking at the center, 2.8 is on our left, 22 is on our right. So is this diffraction that occurs at f22? You can probably notice that f2.8 is actually sharper than f22. And when you start going towards the background, then obviously you get a much more depth of field at 22. You drop off at 2.8, and likewise in the foreground as well. So yes, you get f22, you get a huge depth of field, but you do lose possibly some of the detail on the sides here. You actually get more detail on the side, so it's a bit of a compromise. You're going to use f22. It looks like you do lose a bit of detail in the center compared to 2.8. That's interesting, isn't it? Okay, so let's have a look at the f2 version, the 28mm f2 version. Same sort of thing. We've got f2, and then going right up to, in this case, f16 is the maximum number, f-stop number, which means it's the tiniest hole, tiniest aperture. Okay, so let's have a look. We'll go into full screen and have a look. So that's f2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, and 16. So just going back to the beginning there, we can have a closer look at the center. So that's at f2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, f8, f11, and f16. If we look at another area, so go back to f2, we look at the background here. There's a bokeh at 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, f11, and f16. Okay, let's do between 2 and 2.8 as a comparison. And we'll have a look at the differences between 2 and 2.8 on the f2. So we've got 2.8 on the right hand side here and the 2 on the left hand side. Is there much difference? Yeah, I guess stopping down one stop, there could be slight difference there. Moving to the top of the image, bit difference in bokeh maybe. Let's have a look at yeah, so you can see the difference between 2.8 here and f2. So you got a little bit more bokeh. So the depth of field is slightly shallower. You can see it here on the table mat. So it's slightly out of focus there, and the depth of field is just this area here, whereas the depth of field extends to the back of the mat as well, going to 2.8. I mean, we are pixel peeping here. You wouldn't normally see this, I suppose, in the image. But anyway, these emu eyes in the background, there's a bit more bokeh in f2 compared to 2.8. We'll compare 2 with the aperture completely open to the aperture completely closed at f16 and see what sort of image difference there is. Do we experience a similar situation to the f2.8 version? So this is at f2 and this is at f16. And yes, you actually do get a bit more detail with f2 compared to f16 in the center. As you go towards the back, yes, your depth of field increases substantially and the back wall painting is in focus, including some dust there. And yeah, so everything is in focus basically with a large depth of field of f16. Okay, no surprises. All right, well, let's have a look when we start comparing the two lenses at the different apertures. So we're going to compare f2.8 on both lenses. So on the left hand side we've got the 2.8 version, and on the right hand side we've got the f2 version. So the Summicron is on the right and the Elmarit is on the left. Is there much difference at 2.8? Okay, Elmarit on the left, Summicron f2 on the right. As far as bokeh is concerned, they're both very similar. Not sure whether the Elmarit has a little bit more bokeh than the Summicron, but otherwise they're very similar. So that was 2.8. Let's go to f4 and see how that compares. So we've got the Elmarit on the left, Summicron on the right. This is what I mean by changing lighting conditions. The contrast seems to be better at f4 on the Elmarit compared to the Summicron. But otherwise they're very similar. We go to have a look at the bokeh. And again, they're very similar at f4. There's a little bit of chromatic aberration. You can see the green fringing that's occurring here on the sides. Very similar for both lenses. Summicron on the right and Elmarit on the left here. Okay, so f5.6, we've got the Elmarit on the left and the Summicron on the right. Okay, at 5.6, they both look very similar in the center. We'll have a look at the bokeh again. Very similar. Chromatic aberration. The green starts to sort of diminish, I think, as you go further and further. High in aperture numbers, so reducing the hole, the aperture. Back corner, what do we got there? Also very similar. So let's have a look at f8. Alright, so this is f8 there for the Elmarit, f8 for the Summicron. At f8, I think they're very similar. Bokeh wise, also very similar. A bit more bokeh on the f2.8 on the Elmarit, I think, compared to the Summicron, which is unusual, but anyway, that's what it is. The chromatic aberration is just about to disappear completely now, that green fringing, and we've got a lot more detail towards the sides there. both produce an outstanding image, and that's at f8. I'm expecting similar results for f11. Elmarit on the left, Summicron on the right, both at f11, and again, very similar results. And let's have a look at the depth of field again. It's consistently that the bokeh is a bit stronger for this equivalent aperture in both scenarios for the Elmarit compared to the Summicron on the right. And then the last aperture to look at is the f16. So f16, we've got the Elmarit on the left, Summicron on the right, and that's at f16. Both lenses are performing very similar at f16, which again I was expecting. With loads of depth of field, both are looking much the same. There you go. Alright, so that's the two lenses compared to each other. Other than the Summicron being one stop faster, f2 versus 2.8 of the Elmarit, I think the performance of both lenses are very similar. And this is pixel peeping. I think in reality it would be hard to tell it apart in normal shooting conditions. But how do these lenses compare to 35mm Summilux at equivalent apertures? And then obviously we'd have to crop down these 28mm frames into 35mm focal length, and we'll do a quick comparison. Well, we'll just throw this 35mm Summilux into the equation and just have a look at a couple of shots. I'm interested to find out how much detail I have in the Summilux compared to the 28mm Elmarit and the 28mm Summicron. So we've got the 35mm Summilux here, and this is shot at 1.4. So that's a 35mm shot. Now, then I've got the 28mm. Actually, no, there you go. There's a 35mm at f1.4, and then 35mm at f2. Then I've got the Summicron at 2.8, but I've actually cropped it down to 35mm focal length, and also the Elmarit 2.8 at f2.8, so wide open. So basically all the lenses shot wide open, but the Summilux stopped down for that one shot as well. So we've got the 35mm at f1.4, and then we've got the 28mm at f2. And we'll have a look at how they look side by side. And yes, so the 35mm at f1.4, we've got quite a bit of detail, and the 28mm at f2 wide open, also we've got a lot of detail. I think the 28mm at f2 is probably, in this, the way I've taken the shot, seems to be a bit sharper than the Summilux. The depth of field, well, as you would expect, the Summilux has much more depth of field at 1.4 compared to f2 on the 28, and also with the different focal length has an influence on the depth of field. So what happens when we stop down the Summilux to f2, and we'll compare the two. So the Summilux is at f2 now, and the 35mm Summilux and the 28mm Summicron at f2, and we'll compare the two. And at f2 they're pretty much the same, just as sharp in both cases. The depth of field is similar, but a little bit more on the 35mm because we had to crop down the 28mm, so that explains why there's slightly difference. Why there's a bit more bokeh in the 35mm lens. Both great lenses. Alright, don't know whether we can draw many conclusions from having the reference lens of a 35mm Summilux, other than just showing that the 28mm lenses, both the Elmarit and the Summicron, are very good. And if we want to compare the two 28mm side by side, wide open, let's have a quick look at that. So we've got the Elmarit on the left, Summicron on the right, and again we've got very similar results between the two wide open. The conclusion: the 28 2.8 is compact. The 28 f2 version is a little bit longer, 25% longer. The diameter has changed. The overall diameter is about the same. The filter size has changed. This is 46mm filter size, and this is 39mm filter size. The couple of surprises. Well, okay. This is twice the price, as far as new price is concerned. This is twice the price to that of the 2.8 version. So that's one thing to take into consideration. The other thing is, when something is twice the price, you also expect a higher quality, different aspects. But, you know, generally speaking, I think with Leica gear, and this probably applies to most manufacturers of lenses as well, as soon as you go to one stop faster in the lens, you often go double the price in the lens as well. But anyway, it is double the price. So where I was a bit surprised was that the 2.8 actually performed very well compared to the f2. So both in detail as well as with contrast, edge-to-edge detail, I was really quite impressed. And the quality and the level of bokeh that you get at the different f-stops, or I was shooting wide open basically, was very similar as well. So at this stage, do I upgrade to the f2 or keep my 2.8? Well, what would you do? Would you go for one stop faster, twice the expense, similar quality as far as image is concerned, or do you go for something more compact and save the bucks to spend somewhere else? Well, I think my conclusion is I'm going to hang on to the 2.8. I won't buy the f2 at this stage. It doesn't provide enough difference or benefit to justify the extra costs. So I'll save the bucks and I'll use those dollars elsewhere. Have I made the right decision? What's your thoughts? I welcome your comments. No doubt Leica will come out with different versions of this. They have brought out a couple other versions, different colors and different shapes and different type of lens hoods, one that's integrated as well, and they all come out at different prices. So whether I go for another 2.8 version of the 28mm, whether I go for another f2 version, a new one or a different one that might suit the looks and the desire that I have for that particular lens, time will tell. There is a f1.4 version of the 28mm, which I have not tested. If I can get my hands on one of those, I will make that test as well and do that comparison against my other Leica lenses. Well, I hope you found this interesting. If you have, then give it a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. That's how you support the channel. If it's the first time to my channel, you haven't already subscribed, then do subscribe, press notifications. You'll be notified when the next video is out. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video. Cheers, bye.